Ever wish you had like a cheat sheet for understanding colleagues from different cultures?
Oh, tell me about it.
Well, today's deep dive is all about that. It's about cracking those cultural codes.
Yeah, yeah.
And our guidebook for this journey is The Culture Map by Erin Meyer.
Buckle up. This book, it's a wild ride through the world of cross-cultural communication, and it's full of those aha moments that make you see things in a whole new light, you know?
Speaking of aha moments, Meyer kicks things off with this story about getting like spectacularly lost in Delhi. Can you imagine a low-context American trying to decipher directions from a high-context Indian concierge?
Oh, no.
Yeah, let's just say it doesn't go well.
It's the perfect anecdote, though, to introduce the communicating scale, right? Like a
Yeah.
spectrum from low context cultures where, you say what you mean what you say, to those high context cultures where meaning is often like implied, you know? It's all about reading between the lines.
Okay, so it's about way more than just being polite. This actually impacts how business gets done.
That's
Imagine trying to negotiate a contract where, like, one party values directness and the other relies on these subtle cues.
right.
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to recognize those subtle cues. Like low context cultures like the US, they value clarity, conciseness, think direct emails, to the point presentations.
Right, right.
No need to decode hidden messages.
Whereas high-context cultures rely more on shared understanding and those nonverbal cues. It's like that knowing, look, your parents give you across the dinner table, you just know what it means, even if they haven't said a word.
And sometimes those unspoken words, they speak volumes.
Right.
But here's the thing. Even when you share a language, cultural differences can still trip you up.
Oh, tell me about it.
Huh.
I once had this British colleague tell me, totally deadpan, that he wouldn't have helped if he'd known I was American.
Oh, no.
Turns out he just helped me win a bike race.
Oh, wow.
It took me a minute to realize it was that classic, dry British humor.
That's so funny. Meyer uses the difference between American and British humor to illustrate this point brilliantly. Americans, being more low context, they tend to be more explicit, even in their jokes. Brits, on the other hand, well, let's just say they appreciate a bit more nuance.
Nuance that can leave an unsuspecting American completely bewildered. Which, that reminds me of that story Meyer tells about the American manager in France. Things went terribly wrong on a project, and in a meeting, her French colleagues were all smiles, praising the positive aspects of the situation. I'd be going bonkers trying to figure out if they genuinely thought things were positive, or if that was their way of saying, this needs fixing, but we'll discuss it delicately.
Right. That's exactly what makes navigating feedback across cultures so tricky. What comes across as good feedback in one culture might completely miss the mark in another.
Speaking of missing the mark, Meyer introduces this thing, the evaluating scale, to unpack this. And it's fascinating how differently cultures approach giving feedback, especially the not-so-positive kind.
Yeah, it's a spectrum just like that. Communicating scale.
On one end, you've got cultures like the U.S. where feedback,
Mm.
even criticism, it's often softened. It's presented in a positive light. Think constructive criticism and, those gold stars we talked about.
Right, right.
And then there's the other end of the spectrum, cultures like France.
Mm.
Direct, unvarnished feedback is the norm. It's not about being harsh or anything like that. It's about being honest, transparent, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Meyer illustrates this brilliantly by comparing how American and French teachers, they grade schoolwork. An American teacher might say, great effort, you'll get it next time, even if the work is, subpar. A French teacher is more likely to say, this is not your best work, I know you can do better. Direct and to the point.
Wow, talk about a culture shock for a kid going from one system to the other. But it does make you realize how those cultural norms are instilled from a young age. No wonder that American manager in France was so thrown by her colleagues' indirect feedback. And that's the crux of it. These cultural differences can lead to, major misunderstandings in the workplace. Imagine being on the receiving end of feedback that seems positive on the surface, but you're left wondering if there's this hidden message you're missing. It can be incredibly frustrating.
So how do you navigate those situations? Do you just smile and nod politely, hoping you're not missing some crucial critique?
Well, that's where active listening comes in.
Yeah.
And a good dose of cultural sensitivity. Pay attention to not just the words, but the tone, the body language, the overall context. If something feels off, it probably is.
Right.
Meyer shares a great story about this. She had to give negative feedback to Budi, an Indonesian colleague, and she knew a direct approach would be a disaster. So what did she do?
What did she do?
She got strategic, using food and drink as her secret weapons.
Now this sounds interesting. Tell me more about this strategy.
Okay, so instead of just launching into the feedback, she took Booty out for this, like, delicious Italian meal. They enjoyed good food, good conversation, and then very gradually she started to weave in the feedback. It was subtle, almost hidden within the flow of your conversation.
Wow.
It speaks to that Indonesian emphasis on relationship building and saving face. Direct confrontation is often seen as aggressive, disrespectful, while a more indirect approach, especially one that involves sharing a meal, that helps preserve harmony, build trust.
It's a good reminder that building trust is essential in any cross-cultural interaction, but the way you go about it can vary drastically depending on the culture.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating dimension of the culture map, the concept of trust, how it's built, how it's perceived across cultures. Meyer uses this insightful metaphor of peaches and coconuts to illustrate the different approaches.
Okay, peaches and coconuts, you've got my attention. Break it down for me.
Okay, picture this. Americans, they're like peaches. Friendly, approachable on the surface, easy to like chat with, joke around with. You can build a rapport relatively quickly. But getting to the core, the real vulnerable inner layer, that takes time and effort.
So they're all smiles and small talk initially, but building that deep, lasting trust requires more than just a few casual interactions.
Exactly. Now, coconuts are a different story. They're harder to crack open, more formal and reserved on the surface. They might not be as quick to reveal personal details or engage in like casual banter. But once you've earned their trust, once you've broken through that tough outer shell, you discover the softer, more genuine inner layer.
It's like that saying, slow to warm, but once they're warm, they stay warm. I can see how this difference could lead to misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Americans, being peaches, might misinterpret a coconut's initial reserve as coldness or disinterest. Conversely, those from coconut cultures, they might see Americans' friendliness as superficial, even insincere.
Meyer shares a perfect anecdote about this. The Russian traveler who felt tricked by an overly friendly American on a plane. The American, being a classic peach, was simply being chatty and personable. But the Russian traveler, used to a more coconut-like approach to relationships, interpreted it as a sign of a deeper connection and felt betrayed when the American didn't follow through with a lasting friendship.
It's a classic case of cultural miscommunication, and it highlights the importance of understanding these underlying cultural frameworks. Just because someone doesn't conform to your cultural norms for building trust doesn't mean they're being malicious or disingenuous.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple paths to building trust, and what matters most is understanding and respecting those differences. And speaking of different approaches, what about decision-making? It's a crucial aspect of any business interaction. And I'm guessing the culture map has something to say about how cultures tackle this process.
You bet it does. Just like with communication and feedback, decision-making is another area where cultural differences can make or break a deal, a project, even an entire business relationship. Meyer introduces the deciding scale, another spectrum that reveals a lot about how different cultures approach the decision-making process. On one end of the spectrum, you have cultures that value consensus. Everyone's input is valued, and decisions are made collaboratively. Think of it like a big roundtable discussion where everyone gets a voice.
So a team in Denmark, for example, might spend hours brainstorming, debating, and refining ideas until they reach a decision that everyone feels good about.
Exactly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have cultures where decision-making is more top-down. The boss, the leader, the person in charge, they make the call, and everyone else gets on board and executes it.
So in a culture like Japan, which values hierarchy and respect for authority, a team might present a proposal to their boss, and the boss would then make the final decision based on their experience and judgment.
Precisely. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes our cultural stereotypes don't quite line up with reality. We make assumptions about how cultures operate based on like preconceived notions, but those assumptions can lead us astray.
You mean like those always-on-time Germans we talked about earlier? They're known for their punctuality, but it turns out they're also quite flexible when it comes to scheduling as long as you've communicated clearly and respectfully.
Exactly. Another great example is how the US and Germany approach decision-making. Both cultures are generally considered egalitarian, emphasizing individual freedom and equality. But their approaches to decision-making in a business context are surprisingly different.
So you're telling me that Americans, with all their talk about freedom and individuality, can actually be quite top-down when it comes to making decisions at work. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it's true. Despite their emphasis on equality, Americans, particularly in a business setting, tend to value efficiency and getting things done quickly. And sometimes that means having a clear leader who can make a call and move things forward. Germans, on the other hand, with their penchant for structure and hierarchy, are actually quite consensus-driven in their business decisions.
Wow, that's not at all what I would have expected. I'm already seeing how these assumptions could lead to some serious cultural faux pas.
Absolutely. And Meyer calls this the American paradox. To cultures like Germany, Americans can appear hierarchical, even bossy, in their decision-making style, despite their self-perception as egalitarian.
It makes you wonder how many awkward encounters and misunderstandings have resulted from these conflicting approaches to decision-making. Like, imagine an American manager used to making quick decisions, trying to work with a German team that values consensus and thorough deliberation. Talk about a recipe for frustration.
It happens all the time. Meyer shares a great anecdote about a German manager who was completely taken aback by how quickly his American counterparts would make decisions. To him, it felt rushed, ill-considered. He was used to a more deliberate, consensus-driven approach, where everyone had a chance to weigh in before a decision was made.
It's a perfect illustration of how cultural assumptions can clash in the workplace. And it underscores the importance of not just understanding the what of cultural differences, but also the why behind them. Why do Americans value quick decision-making? Why are Germans more consensus-driven? Once you understand the underlying values and beliefs that shape these cultural norms, it becomes much easier to navigate those differences effectively. It's amazing how even seemingly simple things, like making a decision, can become so complex when you add those cultural differences to the mix.
It's true, and it doesn't stop there. The culture map, it also dives into how cultures approach disagreement, which, believe it or not, is another area that's just ripe for miscommunication.
Oh, I can only imagine. Like, we've all encountered those colleagues who just, shy away from any hint of conflict, right? And then there are those who seem to, thrive on a good debate.
Exactly. And Meyer's disagreeing scale, it captures this beautifully. On one end, you have cultures that see open confrontation as like a sign of a healthy team. They value directness, even if it gets, a little heated. Think of those like lively discussions you might overhear in a Dutch boardroom.
Right.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those cultures where maintaining harmony, saving face, those are paramount. Disagreement is handled delicately, often indirectly, to avoid any sort of direct confrontation.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how these differences play out in real life. Meyer tells this funny story about an American woman. She witnesses this heated argument between two French friends at a dinner party.
Oh, no.
Voices are raised, accusations fly, and the American, she's practically hiding under the table, mortified, thinking the friendship is over.
Oh, no. Did they storm out, never to speak to each other again?
Not at all. A few minutes later, they're back to, laughing and chatting like nothing happened. The American is completely bewildered, but to the French friends, it was just a normal, lively debate. No hard feelings involved.
That's incredible. It really highlights how what feels incredibly uncomfortable in one culture can be perfectly normal in another.
Absolutely. And imagine how these differences play out in a business setting. You've got a team with Germans, known for their very direct communication style, and then Japanese colleagues who are more inclined to, express disagreements subtly. It could easily end up in this tangled web of misinterpretations.
It's like trying to navigate a minefield.
Yeah.
So how do you avoid those explosions of miscommunication when you're working with people from different ends of this disagreeing scale?
It all comes back to awareness and adaptability. If you know you're working with someone who prefers to avoid, open confrontation, you might try depersonalizing the disagreement. So instead of saying, I disagree with your idea, you could say, I'm wondering if there's another way to approach this particular aspect of the project. It takes the focus off of the individual and puts it on the idea itself.
That's a great tip. It's about finding a way to, express your thoughts and concerns constructively without triggering those cultural alarm bells.
Exactly. And sometimes it's helpful to create a space for those who are less comfortable with open disagreement to voice their perspectives. Meyer suggests pre-meetings where team members can share their thoughts and concerns in a smaller, less intimidating setting before the main event. This allows everyone to feel heard and ensures that diverse viewpoints are considered.
Those are such valuable strategies. It seems like the key takeaway here is that regardless of the specific cultural context, successful cross-cultural communication hinges on respect, empathy, and a genuine willingness to adapt. It's about recognizing that there are multiple ways to approach a problem, to give feedback, to make a decision, and that ultimately that diversity of thought and perspective is a strength, not a weakness.
Beautifully put. The culture map provides such a powerful reminder that when it comes to cross-cultural communication, there's no like one-size-fits-all approach. It's about developing your cultural intelligence, honing your ability to like read between the lines, and approaching each interaction with a healthy dose of curiosity and a willingness to learn from those who see the world a little differently than you do.
So for you, our curious listener, the next time you find yourself feeling confused, frustrated, or even slightly baffled by a cross-cultural interaction, remember this. It might not be personal. It might just be cultural. And understanding that difference can make all the difference in the world.
It's about bridging those cultural divides, one conversation at a time, and realizing that the journey itself, with all its bumps and detours, is where the real learning and growth happen.